The topic I'd like to talk to you about today is about small-scale fisheries, and primarily how, by giving fishers involved in small-scale fisheries, by giving them rights, we can lead to more sustainable outcomes. And so my second slide, basically the problem of small-scale fisheries is a global issue. It doesn't matter whether you're in Scotland, in the UK, or whether you're in Vietnam, as in my photograph here, or whether you're in Kerala in India. Small-scale fisheries are characterized by many of the same problems. They're complex. They involve a high number of fishers involved in the system. We're dealing with multiple species. The fleets of fishing vessels are often polyvalent, which makes them extremely complicated from a monitoring point of view and an enforcement point of view. These fisheries are usually data poor, and they often lack any sort of formal management. So I'm going to give you 3 examples, 2 of which are from the United Kingdom, 1 of which is from Chile. So the first one I'm going to talk about is something called the Inshore potting agreement in the UK. Then I'm going to talk to you about Chilean coletas and what we can learn from those experiences. And then I'm going to come back to the UK and look at a small fishery in the Isle of Man. And the thing that unifies all of these fisheries, and I think this is a common theme, is that they all started with a crisis that then led to some form of co-management. So the first example I'm going to talk about is what is known as the Inshore potting agreement, which is located off the coast of Devon in the UK. And it's a really good example of a UK fishery management system that's based on spatial zoning. And if you're interested in learning more about this, you can read about the system in the papers at the bottom of the slide here. So this slide describes the management system. The green area is the landmass of the south of England. So this is the county of Devon in the UK, and the white area is the English Channel. And the potting agreement itself is shown by the coloured polygons. And so basically this is a small-scale inshore fishery, and the management system arose way back in 1978. And it arose out of a crisis which related to conflict between different sectors in the fishing industry. So in the UK industry, we have towed mobile fishing gear, so trawlers, of which you have 30,000 in Kerala, I believe, a considerable trawling fleet. So we have trawlers operating in the area shown in white. And then in the inshore waters, we have small-scale fishers using static fishing gears, such as traps to catch crustacea, like crabs, and they also, from time to time, use set nets. And the problem arose from the conflict between the towed mobile fishing gear sector, so the trawlers, and the static gear fishers. So the trawlers basically were coming into the inshore waters and trawling away the small-scale fishermen's equipment. So this led to conflict until eventually the fishermen themselves sat down and organised an arrangement of the sea whereby there was exclusive use of areas of the sea for certain sectors of the fishing industry. So the areas shown in the light blue colour were set aside purely for the use of the trap fishers. The areas in white are basically for the trawling sector, and the areas demarcated by the other colours are used at different times of the year by both sectors, but never at the same time. So there's this shared use of space in the sea, but the separation by on the basis of seasonality. So if you like, the fishermen have arrived at this management system themselves, and it covers a large area of the sea, extends to about 500 kilometres squared. And there are some really nice emergent properties that come forward from this system. So the key thing here is that the fishers do not have formal property rights to the fishery resources, so to the crabs, for example, within the area. But through this management regime, they do have exclusive access to space, and it's very clear to everybody which area of the sea is demarcated for use by different fishers. Now, the nice thing about this and how it led to more sustainable practices is that the allocation of space purely for the use of small-scale static gear fishers has protected, in this case, the seabed from the effects of towed bottom trawling. So when we look at the seabed in the areas that are used purely by the static gear fishers, we find that there's a lot more life living on the surface of the seabed because there isn't the physical impact imposed by the bottom trawling. Whereas when we go out into the commercial fishing grounds outside the area, which are very similar in geological terms and also in terms of their oceanography, we find, not surprisingly, that the bottom trawling has removed much of the biomass that we see within the areas which are used by the static gear fishers. So undoubtedly a positive secondary emergent property of this management scheme. The other emergent property is that many of the trawl fishermen are fishing for these animals that I show in the inset here. So scallops, this is a bivalve mollusk, which have a very high value in the UK and Europe. And what we find is that when we look into the areas protected from trawling, not surprisingly, the abundance and biomass of these scallops is very high. So that's good because it prevents fishery effects such as Lee effects, so the effects of depensation, which might impair reproduction. But we also find that because there is less occurrence of physical contact between fishing gear and the scallops, which leads to damage of the scallop shell, this means that the lower incidence of physical damage to scallops inside the areas where there is static gear fishing only means that the scallops are able to invest more energy in the production of reproductive tissues, and so that we find that scallops of the same size and the same age have much larger gonads and hence reproductive output in the areas where there is static gear fishing only. We also looked at fish communities and to see whether fish communities might be influenced by the fact that there was this large protected area, the Inshore potting agreement, and we did this by looking at recreational angling data. So recreational anglers typically are targeting larger, what we call prize fish in the UK, and report the landings of these prize fish. So it's a nice data set. So what we did was we compared the size of fish caught by anglers in the region around the Inshore potting agreement, so this protection management regime, and the adjacent sea areas either side. So you can see the sort of the wider southwest of England here, and you can see the coast of France in the bottom of the diagram. And what we found was that some species were conferred protection as a result of the existence of this Inshore potting agreement. But interestingly, it was only species that had relatively short life histories. So although the area is quite large, for species that had slower life histories, so that mature at a much later age in their life, there was no effective protection because these animals have a greater chance of being caught if they swim outside the area by commercial fisheries. Nevertheless, for species with shorter life histories, like this spotted ray, we find that the protection area does in fact confer conservation benefit for fish. So the nice thing about this management system is it's a management system that has arisen from a crisis. It was created by the fishermen themselves. It's been maintained for a long period of time, but it has also had many benefits for sort of conservation, if you like, and also broader sustainability issues. So the other example I'm going to look at is the example of coletas in Chile. And here they have proper, fully implemented territorial use rights fishery systems, or TERFs as they are known. And the fishery in question is for this gastropod snail, which in Chile is called loco, or Concholepus concholepus. Very high value species, fished for by small scale inshore fishers, mainly using diving techniques. So this management system again was born out of a crisis. So here we see our classic fisheries boom bust scenario from the 1950s up until 1989, when the fishery collapsed and the Chilean government closed the fishery entirely for a period of 4 years to allow some semblance of recovery. And in that time, they decided they would introduce a new fisheries policy known as the MEBA policy, which is a horrible acronym, which I'll explain in a moment. But basically, this MEBA policy encouraged fishermen to form small scale businesses. So if we unpack the acronym, what does it stand for? Management and exploitation areas for benthic, i.e. seabed, resources. So the policy was focused primarily on those marine fisheries resources that live on or attached to the seabed. So basically, the policy gives formal property rights to specific areas of the seabed to fishermen, but the fishers have to be registered in a syndicate, or if you like, a cooperative, to be able to apply to have the rights to fish these exclusive areas of seabed. And the aim of the policy was to create a sense of ownership and thereby generate more incentives for sustainable harvesting, because it put control of the management of the fishery and responsibility for looking after the fishery into the hands of the fishermen. The other thing we heard about economics in the previous talk, but the other feature of this was to try and generate more coordination and cooperative behaviour in fishermen to enable them to negotiate better prices and hence improve their livelihoods and well-being in this system. So the Chilean government, collecting statistics on the uptake by the fishing community in terms of applications to formally have a cooperative and be granted formal access rights to a particular area of the sea. And on the basis of the metric of uptake in Chile, the Chilean government was convinced that the policy was working. And I suppose at that very crude level, you could say that it was. But at the time, I had a PhD student, Stefan Gelsic, who's now a professor at Santiago University in Chile, who undertook a very interesting social study to understand the reason why fishers were participating in this management regime, which was clearly quite new when it was introduced. So the study focused on region 5 in Chile. Chile, obviously, a very complex country. And the study covered 3 syndicates or cooperatives. So these are the 3 syndicates. So they have these funny names: AG San Pedro, Cooperativa Los Vios, and Los Lobos. And they have different profiles. So, for example, AG San Pedro had been granted access rights for 5 years, but they had only harvested the snails in their area in 4 out of the 5 years that they had been engaged in this management regime. Similarly, Cooperativa Los Vios, they'd actually split away from this cooperative, AG San Pedro. They'd been operating 4 years, only harvested in 3 of those years. So you can see there's some indication of sustainable practices, of fishermen moderating their behavior. And then this other group, Los Lobos, had recently applied to have access to a specific area of the seabed and had only just formed the cooperative. Now, when we actually do our social science study, and we try to understand the attitudes that are driving the behavior of the fishers, this is where it's quite interesting. Not all fishermen participate in the policy for the same reason. So AG San Pedro very much purported what we called a sustainability storyline. So in other words, they were very bought into the policy right from the outset. They claimed that historically they'd been behaving in a sustainable way for a long period of time. So this to them was a natural transition and way of operating. When we explore the reason for Cooperativa engaging in this policy, we find that their storyline is much more about livelihood maintenance. So their concerns are driven primarily by the fact that They enjoyed being fishermen. They enjoyed the lifestyle that goes with being a diver, going out to sea. But their concerns relate to the fact that more and more of these areas were being implemented, which meant that there were fewer opportunities for them to go fishing. And so their reason for engaging was basically to protect their livelihood and lifestyle. And then finally, when we look at why Los Lobos were engaged with this, so Los Lobos in Spanish actually means the wolves, and we find that all of these divers are actually quite young. And the reason that they engaged with the policy was that they previously had been stealing illegally resources from some of these other management areas. And they saw this, but they justified their actions because they also knew that fishermen who were operating co-management regimes also were going outside their areas and bringing snails back into them and artificially inflating the biomass estimate in the area. So the key takeaway from this is that although you can implement a policy, when you implement this sort of policy, it's actually important to understand why people engage with it. Nevertheless, despite these different motivations for people to engage, the story is overall quite positive, and I'll come to that in a moment. But there is a warning, and the warning is this, that in a country as large as Chile, with the complexity of coastline, a one-size-fits-all approach can cause problems. So, and this was a nice example where the government's desire to impose this policy across the country overlooked existing historical fishery management systems that had operated very successfully. And in this particular management system, which focuses on seaweed harvesting, this management system had it was actually a very inclusive management system that also had provisions within it, within the local community, to enable women who, and particularly widows who had no access to a source of income, to legitimately steal, in inverted commas, as they put it, seaweed that was washed up onto the top of the shore. So they were allowed, they were acknowledged in the local management system and allowed to remove that seaweed so that they also had access to a livelihood for themselves as well. Unfortunately, when the government system came in, it overruled this historical system, and created quite a lot of socially damaging consequences. So there is a warning there. Nevertheless, these systems have been in place for a long period of time now, and Stefan Gelsich went back and looked and published this nice paper in 2008 and in subsequent years, basically looked to see whether fish and other animal communities had benefited from these quasi-marine protected areas. So what he did was he compared fish communities and other organisms within the co-management areas and compared them to the communities in the adjacent areas which were not under the co-management regime. And so when you do your community analysis of your community structure, you find that, so this is a multi-dimensional scaling plot of community structure, and you see that the fish communities within the co-managed systems are very different from the fish communities in the adjacent areas that are not under the co-management regime. And when we look at various community metrics like species richness or diversity, we see that within the management areas, species richness is uniformly high when we compare it into the adjacent areas which are not under the co-management system. The other thing that's also emerged with time is that nothing like a bit of internet interruption. What you find after a period of time is that the attitudes of the fishermen towards environmental issues actually becomes a lot greener, and they start becoming a lot more concerned about things like environmental health and status. So my final example then, we're going back to the United Kingdom. And in the inset map here, you see there's a small island in the middle of the Irish Sea. So this island is approximately 60 kilometers long and maybe 30 kilometers wide. So this is the Isle of Man, and it's a UK dependency. So it has autonomous control over fisheries management within the territorial waters around the island, demarcated by this red line here. So that extends from the coastline out to 12 nautical miles. And one of the key fisheries in the Isle of Man, again, is a scallop fishery. So we talked about scallops before. So here we see a scallop on the seabed. The problem with scallop fisheries is that they are one of the most intensively disturbing to the seabed environment types of toad fisheries that exist around the world. But again, another crisis. So this is crisis number 3. So in part of the territorial sea is an area called Ramsay Bay. So here's a picture of the island. Ramsay Bay is this indentation in the northeast of the island, and it had a lucrative fishery until, that is, the fishing industry completely fished out the scallop population in this area. So with prompting from the fishing industry, the government closed the area entirely for a period of 3 years, and it reformulated, or took the opportunity to put in place a new management regime which also included within it specific conservation zones. So Area 2, Area 1, 3 and 4 were all demarcated as areas where no fishing could occur. But Area 4, importantly, was demarcated specifically for the use by the fishing industry. And more importantly, the fishing industry was given a lease of the seabed resources, so very like in the Chilean example. But the conditions of the lease meant that the fishermen, in order to have access to these rights, had to participate in the science and be part of the management and decision-making process. So what that led to actually was a very data-rich and well-informed fishery management regime. So basically what would happen every year before the fishery was reopened, the fishery management area was divided up into these squares, and the fishing industry went out and surveyed the areas, and then the data was scientifically analysed. This meant we had a map of where the fishery resources were distributed on the seabed. So in other words, the fishermen were able to make management decisions about which areas of seabed to fish. Now, they could have fished the entire seabed, but they didn't. And so we advised them, and they adopted a strategy whereby they focused their fishing on only the areas with the dense aggregations of scallops. And because there was a quota to limit the amount of fishing that could be done, or the amount of scallops that could be landed, this basically promoted a much more efficient type of fishery because it meant the quota was removed from a smaller area of seabed. Now, when we look at the performance outputs of that fishery, so this data is landings per unit effort data in terms of kilograms per scallop dredge per hour fished. So in the bottom graph, we see the performance of Ramsay Bay, so this unique fishery management system. So you can see the period of time during which the fishery was closed with no landings, and then you can see very high landings per unit effort that are very consistent in subsequent years. If we compare that to the performance of the rest of the fishery that is not operating under this management system, you see that the rest of the fishery performs at a very poor level of efficiency. In fact, this has been such a successful fishery management system, which is primarily now run by the fishermen themselves, that the government is looking to turn over the rest of the territorial waters to this management regime. Other beneficial aspects that come out of this is a vast improvement in the age distribution of scallops. So these are progressive data from 2008, so prior to the fishery management system coming into play, and then after the fishery management system, so 2012, and then more recently in 2018. And you can see that the proportion of old scallops within our population is greatly increasing. So these are larger scallops with larger reproductive output. The key thing, though, is that this has actually led to a truly ecosystem-based approach to management. So one of the critical factors for good scallop recruitment to the fishery is the availability of other organisms, like corals, for example, that live on the seabed. So what we're looking at in this inset photograph are animals like hydrozoans and also bryozoans, which form complex seabed topography on the seabed. And the juvenile scallops, you can see here, settle out onto these structures. So if as a result of fishing activity you remove all these structures, you also impede your recruitment in the fishery. So any management system or measure that reduces the amount of seabed disturbed by the fishing activity is undoubtedly beneficial. So the metric here is swept area ratio. So this is the area of seabed swept by bottom trawls or the scallop dredges in the area. And you can see that for Ramsey Bay, this metric is far, far better than for the island-wide system, where we have large areas of the seabed with very intense levels of fishing disturbance. And when we look at that in terms of food production efficiency, the Ramsey Bay fishery, which is shown in the green column here, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but if we look at any of these metrics of fisheries performance, it hugely outperforms the fishery management system in the surrounding areas. The statistic or the row I'd like you to look at is the EROI, which is the energy return on investment. And so you can use this value to compare food production efficiency with other food production systems like beef or pigs or eggs. The EROI for the Ramsey Bay scallop fishery, bearing in mind this is a fuel-intensive fishery, outperforms beef, pig, and egg production in terrestrial food systems. That is extremely impressive for a bottom trawl fishery and does actually demonstrate that with the right management and with the involvement of fishermen, incentivized through ownership, that we can end up with very sustainable fisheries.